The intermediate state could be spoken of in different ways in ancient Judaism, indicating that there was no dogmatic concern in the early period to tidy that matter up. Some could speak not of a soul, but of a spirit or an angel, as when in Acts, the frightened group of believers assume that Peter has been killed in prison, so if they hear his voice outside the door, it must be his angel. And if such people use the word soul as a label for that which continues between death and resurrection, that doesn't mean that they were thereby invoking the full Platonic belief in a pre-existent and automatically immortal element of the human makeup. So this brings us to the point of confusion in the discussion between Jesus and the Sadducees. Jesus insists that when the dead are raised, they will not marry because they will be like the angels in heaven. That's verse 25 on the sheet there. The point of this is not that resurrection life itself will be disembodied, in that sense spiritual, but that it will be unending and immortal, and hence will no longer need marriage and procreation. Jesus is firmly locating the resurrection within a new physical world in which death itself will have been defeated. Resurrection is not reincarnation. One sometimes meets that misunderstanding. Coming back again and again into yet another decaying body within the same world. Resurrection means going on after a period of rest in God's presence into the new creation and being equipped with a body appropriate for that new world. Jesus doesn't say that the dead will be angels. That's another popular misconception. But that in this respect only, they will be like them, that they won't procreate. The other necessary clarification of this passage is that, like many rabbinic discussions, it stops frustratingly just before the actual crunch, the conclusion of the argument, like a chess game where both parties know that the thing is over, and so you stop before playing out the final moves. Jesus quotes Exodus 3:6, where God says to Moses, "I am Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God." And he declares that since God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, this means that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are alive to God, or in God's presence. This doesn't mean that they've already been resurrected. It means that, like the righteous in Wisdom 3, they are alive in God's presence as they await the day when they will be bodily raised. Their present disembodied existence in God's presence is not their final destination. When God puts the world to rights, he will not abandon the creation or them, but will restore it and them. All four Gospels are clear on what resurrection means. Each Gospel ends not with Jesus' body mouldering in the grave while his soul goes marching on into a timeless Platonic eternity, but with Jesus being bodily raised, leaving an empty tomb behind him, with his crucified body now transformed into an unprecedented new type of physicality. That's the story they tell. That's why those stories are so strange. Something genuinely new, the Gospels are saying, has been launched upon the world. What we then find in the rest of the New Testament is truly remarkable, because when faced with death, most people reach for traditional categories and sayings and rituals. Radical change in such positions doesn't happen just because of someone's interesting speculation, but right across the first Christian century, we find quite clear, innovative teaching, namely that God will remake his creation and will raise his people from the dead to share in it, indeed to rule over it, transforming them into newly embodied immortal humans after their time of being dead. Such a position is incomprehensible without the Jewish background, but no Jews had said it quite like this before. It is only explicable on the basis of their belief in Jesus' resurrection. The point, once again, is that we're not simply talking about some vague future reality. This has already begun for the early Christians at Easter. Christians then already share the new life of Jesus in their baptism and in their Christian way of life. Precisely because the biblical view of resurrection is about new creation, its focus can never be simply on a world beyond this one. The early Christian vision wasn't then just about life after death. If God is putting the world to rights once and for all, and if this has begun with Jesus himself, the central Christian task isn't simply to prepare for life after death, but to work for that loving, restorative justice in the present world. The New Testament hope then is founded on two things: the ancient biblical vision of creation and God's will to put it right, and the surprising realization and hence redefinition of that hope in Jesus himself. Please note at this point, it's relevant to the whole discussion, all our language about the future is a set of signposts pointing into a fog. That doesn't mean there isn't a reality to which those signposts are pointing, only that they are simply signs and symbols, and we shouldn't mistake them for realistic photographs of what we'll find when we get there. Now, out of dozens of possible passages, I've highlighted three which you got on the sheet, a bit of 1 Corinthians, then a bit of Romans, and then the end of Revelation. The first passage is from 1 Corinthians 15. Paul is faced with questions about the future resurrection, and he contextualizes them in these verses that you've got within a fresh vision of God's ultimate future, for which he draws on Genesis, the Psalms, and Daniel. He sketches the role of Jesus as the truly human one, through whom the Creator is now ruling the world, and as the Messiah of Israel, through whom Israel's God is defeating his enemies, including ultimately sin and death themselves. These verses are Paul's Jesus-shaped reworking of the Jewish apocalyptic scenario in which God overthrows the evil powers and establishes his kingdom on earth as in heaven. The spectacular passage that you've got there raises all kinds of theological questions, but for our present purposes, I want to pick out four. First, the event for which many Jews had longed, resurrection, had arrived. Jesus' resurrection wasn't for Paul a strange quirk or a bizarre miracle. It was the resurrection from the dead. But this event had split into two moments. Jesus first, everyone else later. The Messiah leads the way and his people will follow. Second, therefore, Paul's focus is not on life after death, the state which immediately follows human death. He focuses on the final stage in that two-stage post-mortem reality. At the end of the chapter, you haven't got it, but I'll just tell you, verses 51 and following, he allows for an exception. If someone is still alive when the Lord returns, then they will not die and be raised. They will be changed, transformed into incorruptible physicality. For them, there will be only one moment of change, but all others will have two: bodily death, life after death, however you describe it, and then after that, bodily resurrection. There is no hint, by the way, of anyone other than Jesus himself being already raised to new bodily life. All others are still waiting. Let the reader understand. Third, Paul has nothing to say here about the intermediate state, about what happens when we die, except for this one word, sleep. The Messiah is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, verse 20. And in the exception just mentioned, we will not all sleep. That echoes a regular biblical image for death. When Paul speaks of it, however, he isn't answering our modern questions about the location or the state of the dead. He is using a regular biblical metaphor as a heuristic tool to denote the first stage in that two-stage progression. Think of another mention of the intermediate state in Philippians chapter 1, where Paul says he would rather leave the present life and be with the Messiah, which he says is far better. I don't think he would have said that had he thought that the intermediate state would be unconscious. So I see sleep as a metaphor rather than something which carries all its overtones. This far better state, but still intermediate, corresponds to the hints you get in Luke and John. Jesus says to the dying brigand beside him that today you will be with me in paradise. That isn't yet Easter. That is an already intermediate state. And Jesus in John promises his followers a place of rest and refreshment, even though resurrection still awaits. And just as there is no hint of anyone other than Jesus being yet raised from the dead, there are no grades or distinctions among the Christian dead. As far as Paul is concerned, they're all in the same place and the same state, and they will all be raised together at the last. Fourth, on 1 Corinthians, corresponding to the two-stage post-mortem reality which believers may expect, there's a very interesting two-stage reality here of God's kingdom. At the moment, as Paul makes clear, he believes that the Messiah is already ruling the world. That may be paradoxical. Paul is still suffering and in prison, and he knows that lots of other people are as well, but he believes Jesus is already in charge, but there will come a time when that has finished, and Jesus will hand over the rule to God the Father when he has defeated sin and death themselves. God will be all in all, that glorious climax at the end of verse 28, and as the prophet said, that is the moment when the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. This leads on to our second main New Testament passage from Romans. Paul's letter to the Romans is full of rich teaching on resurrection, but the argument of the first half of the letter reaches a spectacular climax in these verses that you've got here. Creation itself, says Paul, will be set free from its slavery to decay. God will do for the whole cosmos what he did for Jesus at Easter, having first done this for those who belong to the Messiah. New bodily life for Jesus leads to new bodily life for his people, and then a renewed physical existence for the cosmos itself. And Christians are at the moment, he says, caught between the one and the other, already belonging to the Messiah and in some sense sharing his resurrection life, but still sharing too the groaning of all creation. Verses 21, then 22 over the page there. Where are we? Yes, the whole creation is groaning in 23, and we too are groaning within ourselves. So that's a kind of a cosmic intermediate state in which Paul says Christians currently share. For Paul, the final vision of resurrection is not centered on the state of bliss we are promised, but on the vocation of the truly human people to be kings and priests, in the language of Revelation, ruling the created order on God's behalf and summing up the worship of all creation. This is probably what he means by the glory which all humans will share, redeemed humans will share. This glory is not simply a promise of a spectacular, perhaps illuminated existence, but more specifically the promise, as in Romans 5, of dominion or sovereignty over the world, echoing Genesis 1 and so on. To put it the other way around, Paul says creation has been longing for the wise stewardship of obedience.
Someone may be asking, why do you play this? I certainly don't agree with this gentleman on everything, but it's good to have someone who doesn't agree with you on everything say the same things that you say, so you know they're not just simping for my, it's not just simping for my view. I don't agree with everything he says, but many of the things he says are just facts and not the text. So, and he's a very respected scholar who's written more books than you have spoken words in your life, probably. And he's considered one of the preeminent scholars in the New Testament, N.T. Wright. I don't think that there's a conscious intermediate state. He does. But he points out that the hope is the resurrection. And if you study the early church fathers, you'll see that this was clearly the universal notion. Matthew 22, regarding Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God, the God of the living. Despite what you think the Bible says, that doesn't mean Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are conscious in heaven right now. It's pointing to the marriage supper of the Lamb, with, like in Matthew 8, they'll sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It could mean that, but it doesn't insist. Matthew 22, the God of the living, is not saying like clearly like most people think, because the context is in the resurrection. So that verse doesn't defeat a conscious intermediate state. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it doesn't defeat a unconscious intermediate state. It doesn't say what you think it does that defeats that position. That's not what it means. But that I'm not saying it says the opposite. I'm saying it's ambiguous, just like N.T. Wright said. That's the point. So, good day.